Welcome to The Man Who Kept Dying. This video is a follow-up from the one on my near-death experience. And in that near-death experience video, towards the end, I explained that the experience itself opened the door to a journey of discovery into what I now call consciousness. So in this video, I will highlight some of the steps that I've taken during that journey of discovery. The reason the NDE opened the door to that journey is because following my remembrance of it, because the NDE happened in January, but I only remembered it in September, which I believe is a rare case. But anyway, I had to answer the following questions. Why did I have that experience? What is the light? Who were the beings waiting for me in the light? Especially, why is it that I knew them despite not being able to see them? Why did they feel more familiar to me than my own family? Is there a continuity of consciousness once we die? And if so, why don't we remember about it? Why do we forget about that? Why was it that I could not feel my body? There were many unanswered questions following the remembrance of the NDE for me. So I started to do some research into NDEs, and the first step of that journey was to read a book called or titled La preuve par l'âme. This book was written by François de Witt. He was a journalist specialized in economy, and I believe he was the editor of several publications over his working career. But he took an interest into death later in his life, and he published that book. And that book was very interesting to me because it took the approach of being very rigorous in what he was observing. So his book was going through quantum physics, culture, religious beliefs we've had around death for millennia, but also he studied paranormal activities, near-death experiences, the concept of channeling, the possibility of regression through hypnosis, and all those different things. And each and every time he's got an almost scientific approach to it where he tries not to debunk it, but to see if there's a possibility to find a crack in a story. And in most cases, he could, but anyway, that book was fascinating to read for me because it opened up the box to so many different concepts that I had no idea existed. To start with, you also have to remember that at that time, I was quite fearful of death. And I was also a bit wary about anything that touched onto the spiritual, because I had a belief at the time that there could be bad spirits, they could take advantage of you, and even though just prior to the NDE I'd even lost faith in the possibility of an afterlife, in the possibility of a spirit realm, when I started to open that box again, I was not too comfortable with some of the concepts being explored. But one thing leading to another, I started looking into hypnosis. That looked like, at the time to me, the less risky topic to dive into. And I stumbled across the work of Dolores Cannon. Dolores Cannon was a hypnotherapist many decades ago. We're talking back in the 60s and 70s. And she was helping her patients with overcoming addictions. So it could be alcohol, it could be food, it could be drugs, but she was using hypnotherapy for that purpose. Until the day she had one patient who she was regressing, trying to find the childhood memory or the young adult memory that had triggered the addiction, and the patient regressed to another time. And she was claiming that it was a life of hers, that she knew everything, and she was able to describe, with quite a good level of details, the environment of the time. And Dolores regressed that person several times, and that person each time went through a different lifetime and going back further and further and further in time. So, following that experience, Dolores Cannon developed a hypnosis technique to regress people into past lives. And as part of her work, she's written many books that are sort of like a compilation of everything she's learned, but also conversations she's had, because it went from regressing someone to past lives to actually speaking with spirits and then speaking with extraterrestrial beings through the person being hypnotized. And the method she developed is called today QHHT, which stands for Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique. So after learning about that, I went onto YouTube, typed QHHT or hypnosis, past life hypnosis, something around those lines, and I stumbled across the work of Alba Weinman. And Alba Weinman, believe she used QHHT, but she continued to evolve it to create her own hypnosis method. Anyway, she puts the videos online of her hypnosis sessions with her patients, and it was quite interesting. All these people telling different stories about alien life forms, the afterlife, and so on. But what has always been perhaps my issue with all that is that, yes, there are commonalities in all these stories, but you could always find something that says, yeah, it's just made up or it's the imagination of the person. So I challenged myself and I said, do it and see what it's like. I found a QHHT practitioner not too far away from where I lived at the time in the UK. And would you have it, she was French. So it was quite interesting to meet someone from same nationality. We did a session in English, of course, being in the UK at the time. And that hypnosis session that I had was quite interesting for me. Yes, I saw things. Yes, I saw potentially past lives as alien life forms, non-human forms. So it's funny to look at your hand and instead of having 5 fingers, you're looking at having only 4. It looks nothing like your hand. It was not a problem for me to get into the hypnosis stage and go through the session. And yes, I also felt some energy movements of some energy flows around me, and especially when they call in what they call the higher self. And I really felt something. But nonetheless, following that, I could still find ways to say, well, you know what? It's all well and good to see myself as an alien. It's all well and good to see like civilizations I've never even imagined could be possible. But what if they truly exist, but I'm just tapping into the life of one of those alien beings and I'm seeing that through the eyes of that being, but it's not really me? Or what if it's just my vivid imagination? That could still be the case. So as I was doing the QHHT, or in parallel, I was also reading a series of books called Conversations with God. And this is a 3-part book, if you like, written by Neale Walsch in the late 90s. Those books are still extremely relevant today. The first one contains everything, in my opinion. So if you only had to read one book of the 3, it would be this one. Conversation with God was a very interesting book. But nonetheless, you can read the book and think like, that's so good, but how do I apply that in my life? Or you read it with one understanding, and there could be many interpretations of what is being written. Following the QHHT session, I stumbled across the work of Blair Styra. And Blair Styra is based in New Zealand, and he channels a being named Tabaash. If you don't know what channeling is, it's when someone is able to have a spirit come through and speak through that person. In the case of Blair, Blair's consciousness actually completely vacates his body, and Tabaash comes in, and Tabaash is fully active in Blair's body. What's interesting with Tabaash is that, yeah, he speaks very differently from Blair. You see the same body, but it's not the same accent, and it's not the same personality at all. And I was like, maybe Blair is a very good actor. Maybe he's able to have this sort of act where he creates like two characters and he goes from one to the other. But I was nonetheless fascinated by what Tabaash had to say. And Tabaash had lived on Earth in the Sumerian times, so about 4000 BC. And his experience as a human is invaluable because I had listened to a few channels online, and I always found that what they say is a bit airy-fairy. And they kind of say, well, it's easy being a human, you just don't have the correct perspective, just try to do it that way. Whereas Tabaash would be very different, and he would tell things with his understanding that of all the pains, the struggles, the difficulties that come with being in a human body. So I booked a session with Blair, and that session with Tabaash is when the last walls of defense against that idea of the afterlife, consciousness, the spirit world just crumbled completely. The reason for this is because midway through the session, he would quote something I'd said in the past. And that specific thing I had said was only known to me and my wife. So, and I had said it like years ago. So, for him to be able to pick up on that would mean that either my phone was taped or something, I was being followed throughout all these years, but there was something that I could not deny. And he also mentioned something about my wife, something about her family, which again is absolutely not in the public domain. And even if you were to go on social media, you would never find this information. So something quite private, if you like. And he was able to mention all that. And from there, I was thinking, yes, there's something there, because I cannot. It's the first time I really cannot debunk it unless I'm living the Truman Show, which could still be a possibility, but I don't think it is. Following Tabaash, I stumbled across the work of crimsoncircle.com, which is a website managed by Geoffrey and Linda Hoppe. And Geoffrey is a channel for no less than 3 different beings. Saint-Germain, through the name of Adamus Saint-Germain, Tobias, and Kuthumi. And again, what was very interesting to me is that all 3 of them have had lives as humans on the planet before. So a lot more relatable. And 2 things of interest with Crimson Circles, at least to me. The first one is they talked about being a master on the planet. And for some reason, that appealed to me to understand, say, okay, what does it mean to be a master on the planet? And they explained that everyone's a master. We just have forgotten that we are. And we have these lives where we remember that. So that piqued my interest. And the second thing is they have over 2 decades of channeling content on their website. And once you go through it, there is a lot that explains about what's happening on the other side, why Earth was created, what is the nature of reality according to them, why are we here in the first place as humans, are there aliens, and a lot of other topics. So just give you another building block, another perspective that helped me continue to build my own perspective on all this. And fascinating work, and I still to this day listen to Crimson Circle and to Tabaash as well. Nothing wrong with other channels. I listen to some of them from time to time to see if I can get a different perspective. But I always prefer the ones that have been humans before. There's just that connection. It's a lot more tangible, everything they have to share, in my opinion at least. Once I had done all that, I went back to Alan Watts, and I knew about Alan Watts before my near-death experience, but I wasn't truly listening or reading what he had said. But I went back to the work of Alan Watts, and I went back to the work of Terrence McKenna. So Alan Watts was a philosopher in the 70s. Terrence McKenna, I believe, was roughly around the same time, but he was studying the use of psychedelics and how they take you to different realms and how you can find patterns in those realms and how they always seem to be the same place. Once I had done all that, I went back to Conversations with God. I read it again, and to me, it was like reading a whole different book. And I've scribbled almost every single page in that book, adding annotations of what was my understanding now that I had gone through all this research, and realizing that it was there all along. All the answers that I had been looking for in the first place. I had just missed them in the first time I read it because I had not got that level of, perhaps you call it, understanding. So I would say, if you have to read one book about spirituality, aside from The Man Who Kept Dying, of course, Conversations with God Book 1 covers it all. But you might have to read it many times before you grasp it all. And I'm pretty certain that if I read it again today, I will highlight different things. If I read it in 5, 10 years, I would highlight different things again. It's such a fascinating book that's got so many layers to it. The last person I stumbled across around mid-2022 is Matías de Stefano. And Matías de Stefano is very interesting because he talks about the notion of dimensions, although it's not something that I very much enjoyed getting into. But again, it's just a different perspective about how we have different frequencies that we can call dimensions and how we evolve from one to the other and what perspectives it gives us, depending where we situate ourselves. The reason for dimensions was just to wrap it up from a different perspective, because a lot of the spiritual stuff will tell you, oh, we live in 3D, we're ascending to 5D. I never really grasped all these concepts until I stumbled across the work of Matías, who explained it very well, although through, again, his own perspective. And also, what's interesting with Matías de Stefano is that he remembers past lives from the time of the Atlantis. And it's quite detailed, everything that he remembers. All this has helped me build my own perspective. So you might ask me, Vincent, you've been talking nonstop for 20 minutes probably, and that's all well and good. But what did you learn through all this? And my answer would be a lot. And that's the reason behind the channel as well as the novel, is to share that understanding of those concepts. But to conclude today's video, I will share 2 things that I've learned that are quite important to me. The first one is that, to me, I've come to the understanding that it's all about consciousness. And remember at the beginning of the video when I said that I was a bit fearful of death, I was also not comfortable with the idea of, dark spirits or bad beings. I've just come to understand that there are not really good or bad beings or spirits. There are just spirits with different levels of consciousness, and in the exact same way that there are humans with different levels of consciousness. And it's what we see every day in front of us. So by getting that understanding and not being in a situation of being uncomfortable or fearful with those notions, I was just able to be at peace with it. And as such, if there are beings of lower consciousness, they don't have the same impact on you, even if they tried. The second thing is that there is a before and a after a near-death experience. As I said in my near-death experience video, I don't recommend it to anyone. But it definitely changes your perspective on life. You can't ignore it. In almost every instance, unless you have a negative NDE, which is very rare but can happen, most people who have an NDE change their perspective on life. The outlook on life is never the same. And for me, it's the same story. There definitely is a before and an after. The NDE was also, I believe, very tailored to what I needed at the time. So it might have been a short NDE, but it's exactly what I needed. I needed it to open the door for me to push that door and start that journey into understanding consciousness and what it's all about. I hope you found this video useful and you found it interesting as a follow-up from the near-death experience 1. In the next one, I will be talking about death, because you cannot name your channel The Man Who Kept Dying, write a book titled The Man Who Kept Dying, without talking about death. So that will be the topic for the next one. Thank you again for taking the time to watch this video, and until next time, be conscious, my friends.